In 2017, the Prime Minister of Benin stood before international cameras and offered a profound apology. He was not apologizing for colonialism, but for what his own ancestors had done to their fellow Africans. "We have to acknowledge it," he stated firmly. "It is important for us to tell the truth." But to understand what he was apologizing for, we have to go back 3 centuries to the kingdom of Dahomey. There, King Tegbesu built an empire by selling his neighbors into bondage. At the height of his power, he earned $250,000 per year from slave sales, tens of millions in today's money. His lavish royal court and massive army were entirely funded by this horrific human harvest. This is the story of the African rulers who treated their own continent as a hunting ground. Long before the first Portuguese caravel appeared off the coast of West Africa, slavery existed on the continent. It was a vastly different system than the brutal chattel slavery that would soon cross the Atlantic. In pre-colonial Africa, slaves were often captives of war, debtors, or criminals. They typically retained some social rights, and their children were often born free. Slavery was a byproduct of conflict, not the central pillar of the economy. But this existing infrastructure provided a catastrophic foundation. When European merchants arrived in the 15th century, they did not have to invent a market. They tapped into existing networks of captivity and trade. But the Europeans brought something new, an insatiable, bottomless demand. And they offered irresistible payment in the form of firearms, textiles, and rum. The introduction of European guns completely destabilized the region's power dynamics. If a kingdom refused to sell slaves for guns, its neighbor would, and that armed neighbor would then use those guns to conquer and enslave the peaceful kingdom. A brutal arms race began, where the only currency that mattered was human lives. No state mastered this deadly new economy quite like the Kingdom of Dahomey. Located in present-day Benin, Dahomey rose to power in the 17th century. It transformed itself into a highly militarized state with one primary export: captives. Dahomey was not a victim of the slave trade. It was a leading beneficiary. Every dry season, the kingdom launched organized military campaigns called the Nonu. These were not border skirmishes. They were massive, calculated operations. Tens of thousands of Dahomey soldiers marched into neighboring territories. Their target was not land, but people, specifically the neighboring Yoruba and Mahi ethnic groups. Villages were surrounded in the dead of night. The elderly and sick were often killed on the spot, deemed unsellable. The young and strong were marched back to the capital of Abomey in chains. From there, they were marched to the coastal port of Ouidah. Ouidah became one of the most notorious slave ports in history, second only to Luanda. Here, the captives were traded to European merchants for the guns that fueled the next raid. At the vanguard of Dahomey's slave-raiding machine was an extraordinary force. The Agojie, often called the Dahomey Amazons by European observers. They were an elite, all-female military regiment, fiercely loyal to the king. The Agojie were renowned for their discipline, their bravery, and their absolute ruthlessness. In popular culture, they are sometimes romanticized as anti-colonial freedom fighters, but the historical reality is far darker. For most of their existence, the Agojie's primary function was capturing slaves. They led the vanguard of the annual dry season raids into neighboring territories. They returned to Abomey proudly bearing the severed heads of those who resisted, and dragging thousands of traumatized captives destined for the European slave ships. The Agojie were a terrifyingly effective instrument of state terror. They ensured the steady flow of human capital that kept the kingdom wealthy and powerful. The wealth generated by this human harvest was staggering. Consider King Tegbesu, who ruled Dahomey from 1740 to 1774. At the height of his power, Tegbesu was earning an estimated $250,000 per year from slave sales. Adjusted for inflation, that equates to tens of millions of dollars today. He was arguably one of the wealthiest individuals in the world at the time. This blood money funded a lavish royal court in Abomey. It paid for the vast military apparatus required to sustain the endless wars, and it financed spectacular religious ceremonies, which often involved human sacrifice. The captive was the ultimate commodity, the sole pillar of Dahomey's economic survival. The kings of Dahomey were not ignorant of what they were doing. They were highly sophisticated political operators and rational economic actors. They manipulated European traders, playing the French, British, and Portuguese against each other. They maintained a strict royal monopoly on the trade, ensuring the state took the largest cut. Further west, in modern-day Ghana, another mighty empire rose on similar foundations. The Ashanti Empire was a vast, wealthy, and highly centralized state. Like Dahomey, the Ashanti possessed a formidable military and a sophisticated bureaucracy. And like Dahomey, they were deeply embedded in the transatlantic slave trade. The Ashanti conducted massive raids deep into the interior, capturing Dagomba, Gonja, and other peoples. They maintained a massive internal slave economy to work their gold mines and agricultural estates. But they also funneled tens of thousands of captives to the coastal forts controlled by Europeans. The wealth generated from both gold and human lives made the Asantehene, the Ashanti king, incredibly powerful. Enslaved people were also a central feature of Ashanti religious and political life. At royal funerals, it was customary to perform human sacrifices. Hundreds of enslaved captives might be executed to serve the deceased king in the afterlife. The Ashanti dominance of the region ensured a steady supply of victims for both the coast and the capital. In southeastern Nigeria, the mechanics of the trade took a uniquely sinister form. Here, the Aro Confederacy built a vast commercial network among the Igbo people. The Aro did not rely primarily on massive standing armies like Dahomey or the Ashanti. Instead, they weaponized religion. The center of their power was the Aro Chukwu Oracle, a highly feared and respected religious shrine. The Aro set themselves up as mediators and judges in disputes between different communities. When people came to the oracle for justice, the priests would issue their verdicts. But the punishment for losing a case or being found guilty of a crime was devastating. The condemned were told they were being eaten by the gods. In reality, they were being secretly smuggled out the back of the shrine and sold to coastal slave traders. This cynical abuse of religious authority became a massive, invisible pipeline. The Aro network quietly supplied tens of thousands of enslaved people to the Atlantic coast every single year. If this history matters to you, please take 5 seconds to like this video and subscribe to Unshackled History. Leave a comment below letting us know your thoughts and share this story with others. It is a mistake to think that every African ruler eagerly participated in this devastation. There were those who saw the moral and demographic catastrophe unfolding and tried to stop it. The most famous of these was King Affonso of the Kingdom of Kongo. In the early 16th century, Affonso had established strong diplomatic ties with Portugal. He had even converted to Christianity and adopted European customs. But as the Portuguese demand for slaves grew, it began to destroy his kingdom. Rogue Portuguese merchants, often aided by rebellious Congo noblemen, began kidnapping free citizens. In 1526, a desperate Affonso wrote a series of letters to the King of Portugal. He pleaded with his European counterpart to stop the illegal trade. "There are many traders in all corners of the country," Affonso wrote. "They bring ruin to the country. Every day people are enslaved and kidnapped." He begged the Portuguese king to send only priests and teachers, not merchants of human flesh. But his pleas fell on deaf ears. The profits were simply too high. Despite Afonso's resistance, the transatlantic machine ground on, eventually consuming Congo itself. The true depth of the African elite's addiction to the slave trade was revealed in the 19th century. In 1807, Great Britain, formerly the biggest carrier of enslaved people, abolished the trade. The British Royal Navy began patrolling the West African coast, intercepting slave ships. One might expect the African kingdoms to celebrate the end of this horrific traffic. Instead, the coastal elites were furious. The sudden drop in demand threatened to collapse their entire economic model. Rather than stop the raids, kingdoms like Dahomey and Ashanti simply found new buyers. They continued aggressively selling captives to Portuguese and Brazilian smugglers who operated illegally. When British abolitionists urged King Gizo of Dahomey to transition to trading palm oil, he flatly refused. Gizo explained that the slave trade was the source of the kingdom's wealth. He stated that his people would never accept a leader who stopped the annual raids. The state had become entirely dependent on the continuous destruction of its neighbors. When the transatlantic trade was finally eradicated in the late 19th century, the fallout was severe. States like Dahomey, unable to pivot their economies, fell into steep decline. They were eventually conquered by the very Europeans they had traded with for centuries. But the true tragedy was the legacy left behind on the continent. 4 centuries of continuous warfare and raiding had devastated West and Central Africa. Millions of the strongest, healthiest individuals had been extracted. Communities had moved into harsh, inaccessible terrain just to hide from the raiders. Trust between neighboring groups was utterly shattered, replaced by deep-seated paranoia. The slave trade had effectively halted natural economic and social development across vast regions. It was a demographic catastrophe from which the continent is still recovering. Which brings us back to that unprecedented moment in 2017. The apology from the modern state of Benin was an act of profound historical courage. It broke a long-standing silence that had settled over many post-colonial African nations. Acknowledging this history does not absolve the European buyers or the horrors of the Middle Passage, nor does it justify the brutal system of racialized chattel slavery in the Americas. But history demands the whole truth, no matter how uncomfortable. The transatlantic slave trade was a massive, multinational enterprise. It required the active, aggressive participation of powerful African states. These rulers were not naive victims. They were calculated architects of their own continent's ruin. The history of slavery is a vast, global human tragedy, and most of it has never been properly told. If this video opened your eyes, please like, subscribe, and leave your thoughts in the comments below. Click the next video on your screen to keep uncovering the history that was hidden from you.